Well, welcome back from break, everybody. Glad to see you here. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm a managing director with Venable's Technology Innovation Group, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Four Horsemen of the self-sovereign identity apocalypse. Need a metal moment to get everybody in the mood for things. I don't have metal hair, unfortunately, anymore. I was hoping Vittorio could come up and thrash, but anyways. All right. Now we've got things started. What are we talking about here? So some opening thoughts. So my heart's always loved the concept of self-sovereign identity. My head has found a lot of the elements of it a little troubling. And when I go to my heart, I think some of you know I spent several years in the US government where we didn't have the term self-sovereign, but part of my job was really to be a leading evangelist for the idea of user-centric, privacy-enhancing digital identity solutions. And I still feel now like I'm in the private sector, like I'm an advocate for it. But there's some things about the concepts that were first put out around SSI, some of the elements of it that my head had a hard time buying into. And I think what I want to talk about today is if whether we're calling it self-sovereign, whether we're calling it user-centric, whether we're calling it decentralized, if these schemes are going to work, we need to come to grips with some core truths and also find some ways to address them. Otherwise, my concern is this could end up on what's already a pretty big ash heap of other promising but ultimately underwhelming identity ideas where the market's never really bought into them, and then we're on to the next thing and kind of wondering what we got wrong. So today I want to walk through the Four Horsemen, which are basically things that I think are holding back the adoption of these types of solutions and that need some honest attention from the community. And then I'll end with some things I'm hopeful about. So my intention is to be somewhat critical, but also trying to be constructive, I think, in terms of pointing out a path forward. So who are the Four Horsemen? Well, war, famine, conquest, and death. I think if you've read the book of Revelation, I'm not overly religious, but it's a good one to read if you're reading different books. There are four guys whose appearance each represents a different facet of the apocalypse, aka the end of the world. And in the context of digital identity, in the context of this speech, they represent four things, or actually five. I added a bonus one because I couldn't whittle them all down, that have never really made sense, in my opinion, when it comes to this discussion around self-sovereign identity. And that if they're not addressed and or taken seriously, could ensure the end of the SSI world. And just to be clear, I think the apocalypse would be bad. So this is not me rooting for the end of it. I actually would like to see us find a way forward. I think there's some good things there, but we still need to address some basic ground truths. So let's start now with who are the Four Horsemen of the self-sovereign identity apocalypse. So the first is that key management sucks. The idea that we're going to be building identity systems, premised on the idea everyone's going to want to manage a bunch of cryptographic keys, in many cases one for every attribute they're going to want to prove about themselves. Nobody knows how to manage cryptographic keys, nobody wants to, and nobody really knows how to do it well. Key management's hard. Nobody's really good at it. In fact, looking back over the years of just challenges we've had in the cryptography world, it's where things tend to go wrong because key management is so hard. So if you lose your device and all your keys are on it, then what? Most people aren't going to deal with a 12-word recovery phrase. They're not going to remember this. So what, you then start over, proving yourself again, which is, what I've been told from some companies, yes, that's the idea. What if you're getting a new device? Is there a way to essentially use one device to bootstrap to another? A lot of unanswered questions. And so when I start thinking about how to build systems that are really easily usable by the masses, if we're starting to build off of this premise that you have your device and it controls all of your keys and that's how you get control over everything, but then it's impossible to use beyond that device, we need to come to grips with that. And I think as an example of this, look at what's happening in the FIDO ecosystem. So a lot of you heard Andrew Shikiar's keynote today, all about passkeys and specifically syncable passkeys, where there's a realization in the FIDO ecosystem where we're trying to drive authentication. Because based on private keys, which is awesome because they're unphishable and they have some notable privacy benefits. But if you've got 6 different devices that you're logging in with FIDO, and you have to have a different private key on each one of those, basically they're realizing that the only way to deal with lost, stolen devices, people who have multiple devices, is to, if you really want to bring user-friendly, unphishable authentication to the masses, the new solution is you'll have a centralized provider sync your keys. Which I actually think from a usability standpoint, while I was always taught we should never export private keys, I've kind of come around to the idea that this is actually a pretty good idea because I'm really interested in killing passwords. But if we're talking about decentralized identity, and now we're talking about centralized providers of keys, well, what are we even doing here? And how is the decentralized world, the SSI world, going to overcome the same issue that FIDO's now been grappling with, and I think moving forward with in a pretty constructive approach? Second horseman, where are the validated attributes? So when I first started hearing about self-sovereign identity, 2015, this was sort of the approach. A lot of it was being driven by friends who I would say were sort of on the anarcho-libertarian spectrum of things. The idea was, who the hell is a centralized authority to declare who I am? Why would I have to be dependent on them, be it a government, be it a bank? And, you know, my take was that's pretty interesting. I think you can declare you are whoever you want to be, but that's not necessarily going to get you too far. Around 2018-ish, for some people a little earlier than others, there was a realization with a lot of the companies I was talking to that when it comes to actually using identity in high assurance use cases, nobody who works in those spaces really cares who you say you are unless it's validated by an authoritative source. But meanwhile, there were a lot of companies who went out and got themselves funded around this idea that centralized authoritative sources weren't going to matter. None of the investors, and I talked to a few of them, ever seemed to bother to ask a question, which was, are there any authoritative issuers out there that are looking to digitally sign cryptographic assertions as to the validity of attributes on the blockchain? In the US, we don't even have a digital identity strategy. Come to my 9 o'clock talk Friday morning, you'll hear me whine and complain about that, and also maybe suggest some approaches on what we could take to solve it. But we've got a real problem here where there's no digital identity strategy here in the US, let alone anyone that's focused on validated attributes, let alone something that might actually be on chain. So some of you have heard me say in the past, I actually think this is really at the core of what we need to do in digital identity, regardless of the flavor. Validated attributes are the new plastics. And if you haven't seen The Graduate because you're too young, well, go watch it. It's a fantastic movie, but probably couldn't get made today. But anyways, this is really, I think, what's holding up a lot of things that we're trying to do when it comes to remote identity proofing. Where do the validated attributes come from? And right now, at least in the US, and frankly a lot of other places around the world, we don't have it. Though, as I will point out on Friday, there are some other countries getting a little ahead of us on this. Third, I feel like privacy has been consistently oversold. I'm continually told one reason we need to move to self-sovereign identity solutions is that it's going to restore control over my data to me. And somehow if I present my credential to a company and they get some information about me, are they going to delete it afterwards? Why the hell would they do that? Companies want information about their customers. Governments want information about their citizens. So the idea that something's coming from a self-sovereign credential doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to just be deleted. There's a whole bunch of other issues that need to happen around that to actually enable deletion, revocation of data rights, things like that. Are third-party companies, because I'm presenting something that's a self-sovereign credential, going to never give that data to a data broker, even though they're going to do it through other identity systems? So this illusion is there that just because I might have the ability to release information about myself at a more granular level, which is a really good thing we need to do in identity systems, that it's going to magically disappear afterwards. But that isn't really the case. So to be clear, I think it's really good that we're starting to think about digital identity systems where I can share 3 things about me, but not all 7 that a credential might have. But that's a far cry from the idea that this is going to enable some sort of a revolution that we're going to all be able to take back our data and these bad centralized authorities are never going to get it again. Fourth, why do I need a coin? I have United miles. Figured I could get my Hyatt points here, even though it's the ARIA that told me that when I was checking in, which was nice. I got Marriott points, a whole bunch of different alternative currencies I'm managing. And now there's an idea that I need to have another alternative currency just to prove who I am, or if I'm a business, I need to acquire these coins to pay for a service. Now, thankfully, I'm seeing a lot less of this these days. I think as we're looking at the verifiable credentials model, I think most people are realizing maybe tying everything to a coin isn't going to be the most efficient way to gain market adoption. No? Okay, thanks, Kalia. I'll be happy to do Q&A in a bit. I still get pitches every month from companies talking about how I need to have identity verification tied to some shitcoin. So I agree things are not happening there. I think the community is evolving, but that doesn't mean that there's not parts of the community that are still insisting that this is something that's important. And the bonus horseman, I said I couldn't keep it to 4, I wanted to go to 5, was choice. And I think this is something that we've all been struggling with in identity systems because we want to give people choice. But one thing we've also found is that sometimes if you give people too many choices, it overwhelms people. So, you know, do I share my name and date of birth but not age of gender? Do I share my age and not gender but name? Screw it, I'll share everything if you give me a $5 Starbucks card, which I think is what most people still do these days, unfortunately. So when you overwhelm people with these things, it tends to create sometimes more challenges, and then they just say, screw it, just let me get through to this thing and don't make me make so many choices. So I think a lot more work is needed on the UX here. How do we enable granular sharing of attributes without making it a burden on people? You know, Ian Glazer was talking earlier today about the idea of agents. You know, could wallets perhaps be agents for us that might simplify some of the UX? Again, I think we're in early days here. I don't think we've solved it, but I'm encouraged by, well, some of the work that's happening there. But part of what I wanted to do today was make a plea, which is as we're coming up with new systems, let's not build identity for the 1%. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, I'm an identity weenie. All of you are identity weenies because you're here at Identiverse. We have a habit of having identity systems designed by identity weenies for identity weenies around the things that we all dream of in terms of the way that we wish these systems would work, but that often overlook some of the basics about the types of tools that most people actually are looking to use or have the ability to easily manage or use. And so I think when it comes to designing these systems, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of how can we actually bake the goodness in that we all dream about in this identity weenie community. And again, I do love you all in this. Weenies used very affectionately. But there's a gap between that and the actual user experiences in terms of what we can actually easily bring to market. So I've been a little critical. Let me talk about some things I'm excited about. Standards are emerging. This is awesome. Things emerging from the W3C around verifiable credentials, around decentralized identifiers. This is good. Again, I'm starting to see a lot less, how would I say, compared to 3 years ago, pitches around here's my own proprietary solution that's not going to interoperate with anything else, and more, hey, we're actually building off of standards. Love the OpenID paper a year ago, looking at OpenID for verifiable credentials, and that it talked about verifiable credentials not as something that uses a specific technology, but the concept of what a verifiable credential could be, which I thought was another really constructive step forward, and a lot of good examples in there of how you can get to some of these outcomes that we're looking for without necessarily having to tie it to blockchain technology. I'm excited about digital wallets that are starting to emerge, although we got a long way to go there in terms of, you know, as I said before, helping solve some of the UX issues. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of serious people, and a lot of you are in this room, are now building systems that aren't embracing these four horsemen, five, and are taking more pragmatic approaches. So a closing thought. I have to bring up a vintage Cloud Identity Summit t-shirt. This is my daughter, who is now much larger than in this picture. She used to bring a small size t-shirt home for her, and it was her nightshirt, and now she's 5'7", and the shirt's too small on her. Anyways, things are happening. But ain't no party like a relying party. A lot of the promise around decentralized identity, around self-sovereign identity, is based on what it offers the user. But what is the value for relying parties? The idea of any new identity system that's going to come with restrictions on what relying parties can do versus the legacy tools they're using today is probably not something that they're going to find overly compelling. And so for this new ecosystem to gain traction, we must find ways to appeal to relying parties and end users, make it easier for them, give them incentives to actually want to come in and use these types of systems, as opposed to just telling them it's good for them. I think we've seen where that can go in the past. So let's listen to the big service providers, listen to RPs, and then they have no party like a relying party. So with that, we can have more death metal, or I'm happy to take questions, because I think we've got a little bit of time. Perfect. Now we can have the graphic without the music. Oh, I kind of like the music. Anyways.
If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand.
Little Jeremy.
Coming your way with a mic.
There are a lot of specific threats out there. Growth in digital injection attacks, social engineering is still extremely pervasive. ITRC released a report today that said the growth in identity theft was flat from 2021, and we thought that was the big rise in fraud. What particular threats are you concerned that we're particularly vulnerable against now, and how do we fix them? Is there any one that scares you the most?
I mean, Andre's keynote yesterday, so I always look forward to his keynote every year at first CIS, now Identiverse. I thought it was the best one he's done in years, maybe the best ever. And kind of like him, I'm pretty negative on what we're going to see with AI. Though getting back to talking both about, the value of private keys, AI is going to get really good at launching more sophisticated attacks, at impersonating people, potentially getting around biometrics. AI, to my knowledge, doesn't know how to defeat public key encryption. And so I think this is actually where I think verifiable credentials may end up playing a really important role. I certainly think, proving possession of a private key is going to be something that is going to be perhaps our best defense against some of these more sophisticated attacks that emerge over the next few years, at least until we have quantum computing married with AI, and then we're all, I don't know, then I got to retire or go live on an island somewhere and just not cope. But no, I think the AI threat is very real, and I don't know that we're prepared for it.
Hi, presentation. Do you have any idea or when regulations such as open finance, those movements in Europe, the kind of benefits they're gonna get in with the SSI, how people are gonna be sharing the information across let's say security, systems?
I mean, the Europeans are leaning into this harder than the US and some other places, and I guess I'm kind of glad they're going first for a lot of the reasons I outlined here. I'm actually skeptical about how much it will take hold. I mean, I think we have, how would I say this? In both the US and Europe, we like to point to laws that are in place that say we've changed something, but I point out the EIDAS-1 is the Real ID of Europe, or Real ID Act is the EIDAS of the US. Real ID Act's 20 years old almost, now 18. And we still can't get to compliance. And EIDAS, for all the hype around EIDAS-1, and what I thought was a pretty novel architecture that offered some value, I think less than half of Europeans can actually use EIDAS-enabled systems today. So where they're going with version 2 is very ambitious, but I guess I tend to lean more skeptical that they're actually going to realize what they want to see because they're making it so ambitious and so complicated. So I hope to be proven wrong.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Claire.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. I'm Claire Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Decentralized Identity Foundation, otherwise known as DIF. So thank you for bringing self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity to the audience. I'm always glad to see people talking about something that's near and dear to our hearts. But I just wanted to bring up one example from this morning, and this is where relying parties benefit. And Alex Simons, who was in the Alex Simons keynote today, you heard him talk about Credivera. And with Credivera, party, an employer for a highly regulated manufacturing or industrial environment can know that the people that show up, the employees that show up, have either the health certs, maybe they don't have to CPR or first aid, and maybe any other job-related certification, handling specialized machinery, et cetera, knowing how to operate an oil rig. I've worked with Credivera before. They're doing a lot. But I just wanted to bring up at least one example. I know there are many others of where the relying parties are benefiting from self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, and we're still in early stages. If you look at the specs, the W3C, the DID and VC, the decentralized identity, verifiable credential specifications, they're data models. And so it's up to the implementers to figure out how they avoid the Four Horsemen. But I want to thank you for bringing this front and center and look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thanks, Claire.
So I guess the galloping skeleton of death that I thought that resonated most with me is that what I guess you could call the cat's out of the bag problem, which is once I've given you my data, what happens, right? Because we all know that they're not going to delete data. So I wanted to hear sort of what are your thoughts for mitigating that or addressing that?
I mean, I think you could probably do some of it with policy. Not that I'm optimistic at all that we're going to have a comprehensive privacy law here in the US anytime soon. Other parts of the world are moving faster. We'll probably end up with a patchwork of state laws. But I'm not sure, it's my 5-minute warning, I'm not sure any of those are going to address any of that either. So, I don't know. There are things where I think there's, how do I say this? I look a lot at both technical and policy problems where I think there's an easy solution, and I know how to work on those and move something forward, and then there are those where I really don't know what to do, and I'm not particularly convinced that that whole issue of, when I worked in government, who was it? It was Colin from Deloitte in our office who coined the term. We talk about data minimization all the time, but the reality is most people talk about data. Most people, in fact, practice data promiscuity. And it is a problem, but I don't know that this technology is going to be the one to solve it. Though if I'm wrong, if somebody has if I'm missing something, please grab me afterwards and let me know. I'd love to hear about it.
Any other questions?
Jeremy, thank you for the presentation. Since I know you're doing a lot with government and, what do you see as in this area legislation that might be coming our way?
With broader digital identity or with decentralized self-sovereign specifically?
Both.
I mean, broader, so this is, thank you for foreshadowing my Friday speech, where it's, entitled, "Oh, say, can you see a U.S. digital identity strategy?" And the answer is no. So there, you can sleep in, stay late at the party Thursday night. I have some thoughts in terms of what that could look like. I think some of you know I run an organization called the Better Identity Coalition that's been focused on what I would call the policy layer of identity. Look, there's a bill that's cleared the Senate, has a tougher path in the House. Separately, we have a White House that can't quite figure out if they want to do something here or not, more broadly. And so I'm not actually overly optimistic right now that anything significant is going to happen in the U.S. There's a lot of pockets of cool stuff happening in different agencies. We heard, I think on this stage right before the break, from TSA and DHS and NIST in terms of what's going on with mobile driver's licenses. But and some of the good folks who are driving it in this room, it shouldn't be falling just to them to drive things forward. There ought to be a bigger, holistic approach to how we tackle this issue. And I don't see that happening right now, at least in the US. There's a lot more work to be done.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
All right, thank you.